Welcome to the Liberation Lab podcast, insights and interviews for the disruptive educator. Y'all, we got a special one today. I have my sis on. Listen, I could go on and on about how I feel about her and what she means to community, but I'm still going to let her introduce herself. Tell the people who you are, what you do, and why you do it.
I'm a lot of things. Okay, but first I'll start with my given name. I am Yari Mercedes. I am a mother, I am a sister, a daughter, a friend, a partner, a human being on these ghetto earth streets. I am also a lover of people. I'm an empath. I'm a researcher. I'm a lover of learning, forever academic of community, academic of books. And I'm in the pursuit of being who I am. What I do a lot of things because I wear many hats, as I stated some of my visible and invisible identity markers. But what I do professionally is I've been an educator going on my 17th year. I started off as a teacher, leader, mentor, coach, to now in a more educational administrative position, which means that I coach, folks across stakeholders within districts around how they're thinking about practices and policies that really impact their students, their families, and their communities. I have a more touchstone, I would say, work to curriculum and pedagogy, because I started there. I was a teacher of the babies elementary school for nearly 10 years. And they taught me so much more than I think I taught them, because under my, programming and conditioning, while I did some good, I think, I also caused a lot of harm. And so part of doing this work is also making the return, right? The return to doing well with the seat that I'm in, and understanding that the practices that I once held on to were causing more harm than they were actually, moving my students and my families and my communities forward. And so those are a little bit about who I am, but mostly I'm a human being that is really trying to leave this world better than what I came in with. So I'm always in the pursuit of that.
Amen to that. So, y'all, my sis is brilliant. Shout out to
Thank you,
her. I want to
brother.
publicly acknowledge her brilliance and also say congratulations publicly and recording on her achieving, her working and achieving her doctorate. I know
Thank
how much
you.
of a labor of love that was, how much you put on the line. And I'm sure, knowing you and knowing your heart, you're going to talk about, how this is ours and how much people sewed in. And
Mhm.
that is absolutely true. Just for the purposes of what I want to say, I just want to acknowledge, you know, the the degree only serves as a reminder of what we already knew about your brilliance. And so I just want to make sure to put that on record for anybody who does not know and who is just getting to recognize and become acquainted with your brilliance, that truth. So I want to honor
Thank
you,
you.
sis.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother. Listen, it's the last thing that I will ever defend. As a Black woman, we defend many things, but this is one I chose to put myself through the fire. But it's a little razzle dazzle that proves to these institutions about what we've already been. And so I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful. As I said previously, to my people, to my family, to my community, to my sisters that really held me through this process, that really mentored me through this process, and still do. And so this is a community win. This is a collective win. And, this is us. This is ours. I didn't do this on my own, and I'm still not doing it on my own. So I appreciate you, yes, the countless hours, the blood, sweat, tears, all those things, actually. It's important to say and name it. And I also didn't go through it alone. So I'm very grateful for those that were there for me, that sent care packages, that sent gift cards for food, sent notes, that sent, their well wishes, their prayers, their guidance, their love. I'm very grateful to community and I'm very grateful, brother. So thank you. I appreciate it. And it's the razzle dazzle now. It's the razzle dazzle on the
Absolutely.
name, but it's still the work. The work is the work. Now I'm just able to, because of the way the systems work, I'm able to get through more doors so that I can leave them open for those that are coming along with me.
For sure. For sure. So I encountered, obviously, through us being in the community, reading through and witnessing your work as you co-authored the article that we are referencing, kind of as a backdrop for our discussion. All we need is one mic. A call for anti-racist solidarity to deconstruct anti-black racism and educational leadership. Whoo, Lord! I mean, the title is heavy. You know what I'm saying? The title, you saying some things, all right? Even in the title. So talk to me. What inspired you to co-author this work, and what were your hopes, and what are your hopes as folks continue to encounter this work for putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard to put this brilliance forth?
Well, I mean, that article, shout out to Dr. Soribel Henao, who actually, again, Black women need Black women to thrive. And I'm so grateful for the Black women in my life that allow for me to thrive spiritually, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. I really want to thank them. Shout out to Dr. Soribel, who was really thinking of putting out this article for a leadership journal around us thinking about leadership preparation and why that was so important for us to be curious about, and how the research was moving forward into thinking about how do we really center this idea of like anti-racism within the context of leadership preparation, right? If we want to do anti-racist work within school systems, then how are we really thinking and considering what that work looks like in leadership preparation programs across the nation? So, we were really determined to, put out a piece that really gets folks curious about, one, that work, and two, the folks and the researchers that were really doing that work even before we decided to write this article together. I mean, this article was some years ago, is actually the backdrop of my own research. I'm not sure that I would use the term anti-racism anymore. I think under the context of the anti, my research was more closely connected to how are we critically and responsive, right? Instead of being anti something, what are we working towards? And so, but when you know better, you do better. And how to be an anti-racist was really at the backdrop. Shout out to Ibram Kendi and his work and his research, really at the backdrop of the movement of, and many other researchers before that, but, really at the backdrop of us thinking about how does leadership preparation programs in the context of leadership, specifically the principalship, look like when we're thinking and considering to change the experiences of students, families, and communities, right? If leadership preparation programs are deeply colonial and are not centralizing race, then how are we expecting leaders who then sit in the principal position to really have or be equipped with the strategies that they need, right, to fight against racism or to centralize race when they're thinking and considering policies or structures or curriculum decisions when it comes to their communities? And so, shout out to Dr. Soribel Henao, who really, it was her idea to think about the hip hop element and using Nas in terms of the lyrics to that title, but really resonated with us around the concept of solidarity, right? The concept of all you need is one mic is really us thinking and considering is, what does anti-racist solidarity look like when we're thinking structural and institutional and systemic change when it actually comes to preparing leaders that are going to be working with and alongside communities that are dealing with racism, that are dealing with the deep impacts of, this hurt and harm to communities, particularly Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities of color that disproportionately are affected because of this endemic disease in our nation. And so, that research was how we were calling in leadership preparation programs to consider not just one social justice class, not just, one course around, but really how are all courses within leadership preparation really centralizing race and the impact of racism when it comes to preparing leaders to lead schools.
I think about that, we were talking before I hit record about just the journey of being, assistant principal at my school for the last couple of years and now transitioning into the principal seat. And one of the things that I find is it's almost designed, right? Like if you've ever seen like the animal documentaries with the meerkats, right? And they're foraging, they're on all fours, they're doing work, they're in the ground, whatever have you. But when they want to know what's coming, want to know if there's danger, or even, where their people are, they stand up on their hind legs and look out on the horizon, right? And I find that when I am in the institution of schooling, and I'm using that on purpose, that there's so much that I have to do that keeps me foraging on the ground, but I need those moments where I can look up on the horizon to be able to navigate better, to see, to dream, to freedom dream. And sometimes those opportunities are not there as much as I would like them to be. And so when I think about your work and I think about all the things that you stand for, knowing you and being blessed to be in community with you, I think about a call, right, to to be critically race conscious and what that means for not just those you serve, but for yourself first.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when we talked and you asked me, I'm just going to say this real quick and I want you to go, right? But I think about it in regards to, you asked me a question way back when about why I named it Liberation Lab. And I said, you can't give it out if you don't have it. Like you should be a mad scientist for this, that it lives and embeds in you before you give it out to others. And so I want you to speak to that. I know you got something on your heart, but I would also want to ask, like, for folks who are listening and are like, what does that look like? How do I evaluate myself? How do I begin this work? What does that look like? Could you kind of paint a picture for us in terms of how to develop? Go ahead, though.
So one of the and thank you for that question, because that's really at the foundation or the root is like, how do we garner curiosity about ideas about who we are, right? And not just ideas about who we are, but why is understanding who we are important? Because it has deep implications on how we behave, right? And how we interact with others and our positionality. And so, part of my research, I was really curious around, because part of my own story is that, I had a preparation program that actually unearthed this desire for me to want to know more about my racialized identity. As a Dominican parents who immigrated here from the Dominican Republic to the United States, being American, but also being racialized, right? At that time, folks racialized the identity Latinidad or Latinx. That is not a race. And so I was beginning to become very curious as to my own racialized Black identity and being at the intersections of, my ethnicity, my culture, and what that meant under the context of the United States, right? When growing up, folks are telling me that I am Spanish, knowing that I had no family members from Spain, but knowing that I spoke Spanish. And so really being in a leadership program where, shout out to Dr. Mark Gooden, one of my advisors, one of my committee members of my dissertations, one of my forever mentors in this. A lot of his research was really around the impact of leadership preparation programs that were centered in anti-racist practices and ideologies, and really having leaders that were going to lead racialized communities, because white people are also racialized, that were going to be leading racialized communities, is how are they understanding themselves? How are you understanding your own race? How are you able to have conversations about race and racism, right? How are you understanding who and whose you are? Who did you learn that from? And so I began to become curious about, like, this is really important, right? Because my entire life, I was curious about my racial identity. In undergrad, I was an English and communications double major with a minor in Black studies, because I just knew that in Boston, people were asking me what I was. People were asking me where I was from, right? Knowing that I was American, I knew that my parents had immigrated from the Dominican Republic, but I wasn't Dominican, right? I wasn't from the Dominican Republic, because when I had gone to the Dominican Republic, they called me a Yankee because I wasn't born there. But yet here they're asking me, what I am. And so it's sort of this juxtaposition that really got me curious, as around racial identity, around understanding who we are, the importance of that, the importance of having a racialized lens, the importance of having race conversations, the importance of understanding systems and how systems are racialized. And so that became the backdrop of my own research, right? How are leaders curious about, how are leaders really understanding race and racism? And how are they actively working against systems, structures, and policies, right, that are racist and are causing harm to their students and their families and their communities? And also, how is that affecting their bodies? And so my work initially started by being a part of a program that really was intentional about creating not just a class, right? Not just a class around social justice, but really a entire pathway where we were having race conscious conversations about curriculum. We were having race conscious conversations about ed and also law, where we were having race conscious conversations about school budgeting, right? And zoning. And so, I became very, I want to say, I don't know what the word is, but really my professors that brought theory to my life, and that North Star, as Dr. Bettina Love calls it, of introducing us to critical race theory and to understanding the endemacy of racism within the context of education, then started to, really spark my curiosity as to my own experiences, my own neighborhood, my own trajectory as a Black woman, my hardships, and also what I dealt with. Then I became curious as to, like, I want to know more. I want to know about who I am, whose I am, because what I learned about who I was and whose I was under the gaze of a whitewashed and white supremacist context. And so I think it's important for us to build an infrastructure and leadership preparation, and a leadership pipeline that really has those that want to lead communities curious about why are things the way that they are. And not only why are the things the way that they are, but also how has that impact my own experiences in education, my own experiences in life, my family's experiences. And so, that's part of my work. Part of my work is, how are we doing the work remembering while also doing the work of making the return to ourselves, right? And how that is important under the context of leading communities. Because once we have a deep understanding of that, then we have the tools to cause less harm in the communities that we are co-leading and being a part of in education. It's really important. That work was really important for me to do. One, the racial literacy work of understanding
Hmm.
that for myself, but also how that work is so important for us to see ourselves, because to see is to honor. And if we cannot see ourselves and other people, then we cannot do the work of leading communities. One of the beautiful things that came out of my research and my beautiful garden of leaders that were really deeply intentional about doing critically race conscious work is, all of the leaders that were part of my research were racialized as Black, and they had a really deep sense of who they were, right? And, their mothers and other mothers were so foundational to that practice of really building the foundation for them as to why the work of liberation and social justice was so important. But also, they were the model and the mirror of Black women that, one, were protecting their families, Black women that were advocates, in experiences or moments of injustice, right? But really, Black mothers and other mothers that were helping those Black leaders in their upbringing remember and making the return to themselves and the importance of their Black identity and the importance about who they were and whose they were. And so in turn, these leaders know that real importance of doing that work within their own communities. And so, yeah, part of that work is understanding ourselves, is understanding racial literacy, is understanding the impact of race within our context, is understanding the experiences of racism and anti-Blackness. And, how are we intentional and at the front lines of doing that work? And so once I became more curious about that work, then I became more curious about reading folks that were doing this work for decades. And
Yeah.
so, it's really at the foundation of my work and how we think and consider what does leadership look like when we really centralize race and we're really intentional about, really restructuring, reconstructing environments that allow for students to thrive, that allow for students to have joy, that allow students to really have not schooling, but really education where they're able to be curious, where they're able to think critically, big C, not little c, where they're able to think critically about power, about systems, about structures, where they're able to, really build cultures of intellectualism within their own communities and think deeply about themselves, about other people, build their emotional intelligence. So all of these things really was, really was at the forefront of my work and how we should all move towards thinking about that in a deep, intentional way.
I think first, so much was shared there. Thank you for just listening us with that that wisdom there, and for real, I hope people who are listening, you know, go back, re-listen to everything you just said again. But even as I'm processing in this moment, I'm thinking about there was a sister by the name of Gertrude Elise McDougald Ayer. She was one of the first black women principals in New York. And some of her work before it was culturally responsive teaching and before it was, you know, all the things that we now have as buzzwords in education, she had community alliances and folks who were working with just deep levels of joy and community. And, I think about her work in regards to what you said, right? Because even now, as I am thinking through the things that we have to navigate as a leadership team to create the space for joy and ingenuity and creativity and life and all the things that I want to see happen in a school that I'm a part of. I think about folks like her who, one, went and did it, right? So I can dream and believe it's possible because I can look and see folks who have done it, right? And I think that that needs to be said. But two, also think about what you said with regard to the solidarity needed to endure, to rise above, and to dismantle these systems that work against creating these types of spaces you're talking about. For folks who are listening to us and listening to you in particular, what advice do you have for leaders who are getting a hold of their critical race consciousness? They are now kind of waking up, if you will, from a bad dream and looking at the landscape and saying, well, how do I begin to tackle this? What do I do?
Well, a lot of folks want like the quick fix or the answer.
Checklist.
And, it is just the pursuit of doing this work, right? If you know that you are now starting this work, keep doing this work, right? Keep unlearning, right? Keep decolonizing, right? Keep asking yourself the tough questions while also and actively making the changes, right? And so, if you know that your curriculum or if you know that there are some practices that are causing harm because now you have an awakening or your consciousness is sort of developing, then what are the structures that are you developing within your community that is really interrogating those practices, that's really interrogating the experiences of your students? Is your community, are your parents, involved in a meaningful way, not in a performative way, not through one survey, not through one shot deals, but really just thinking and considering how are the people that you are serving, the folks that you are serving, that you are leading, right? The co-leaders within your community. How is that work collaborative? Right? How are you constantly asking the tough questions, right? How are you being vulnerable to the mistakes that you make, right? Even this article, as you highlight, I know that once I write something and once I put it out in the world, I'm like, don't ever read it because I know that tomorrow, I'm going to know something more. I may not use the particular language that I used yesterday that I will use tomorrow, right? Because I'm still working through the way that, my conditioning and my socialization has had a hold on me. And so, I would say, it's just sitting in the and space and really fumbling through
Mm,
work,
mhm,
fumbling through
mm,
like the work of how are we interrogating the experiences of our students? Are students really, yesterday I was part of a beautiful conversation with some high school, brilliant high schoolers and talking about, their experiences around, uniforms and the autonomy to their bodies, right? The way that they're talking infrastructure, right? And the architecture of their buildings and the water and the facilities that they are, coexisting with that they don't deserve, right? Talking about testing and how often and, every 2 weeks they're constantly tested and, the lack of funding and curricular, extracurricular activities. And so listening to these young folks is like, man, these are the experiences of our young people. And I'm wondering if the leaders of their communities, right, are really listening to their experiences? Or are we replicating the same thing that we're saying that we're trying to not do, which is, top down approaches to making change or making change in a performative way, right? If
mhm.
you're curious power, right, and race is one of the structures of power. If you're curious around power, your position and your positionality as leader of the school is also a power position. And so you can also create harm if you don't have a deep level of awareness around that positionality or your racialized positionality, even in that position. And
For
so,
sure.
my advice is, do the work of understanding like, who are you? Whose are you? How do you know? Who taught you? What are you curious about? And then how are you also actively doing the work? How are you understanding race? How are you understanding your own racial identity, right? How are you understanding race under the context of the communities that you lead? How are you understanding racism and the experiences of your communities, right? And how are you actively working against it, right? Are you acquiescing, or are you really making the tough decisions that are really going to garner some meaningful change within your community, right? One of the things that I was really humbled by to hear from the leaders that are doing this work is that they were really intentional about being at the front lines of making policy changes, systemic changes within their systems, structural changes, whether that was hiring, whether that was curriculum, whether that was facilities changes, whether that was the environment, the way that the environment looked, whether that was addressing teacher mindset, professional development for their communities. We can, our communities are really depending on it. And we have to really think about how are we actively disrupting,
Mm-hmm.
harm
Mm-hmm.
that's really, racism kills. It's killing us spiritually, emotionally, mentally, psychologically, and our babies. It steals from them. It steals their imagination, their joy, their ability to see possibility. And, we have to actively be on the front lines of doing that work together. And so if you're in a leader of a school, how are you actively having racialized conversations? How is race
That part.
centered within the context of your professional learning, for all professional learning, for your data conversations? What data are you looking at? What data cements racist ideology, right? What data cements anti-Blackness within your community, right? How are you constantly, inviting folks to think and consider things differently? And so, that would be, my advice. How are we constantly in the pursuit, you know, of doing that deep work, of doing my
Sure.
sister's work, shout out to Yoli, who's also Celie Ruiz, who's one of my mentors, my sister is one of my other mothers in this work. How are we doing that excavation and that archaeology of the self,
Of
right?
self. Yeah.
How are we really understanding so that we can get to that critical piece? And, critical love is not just, what folks think of or have this ideology of love or the fluff, is having an ethos of critique, is what Bell Hooks talks about, these ingredients of like, being responsible to each other, that deep commitment, that trust, that honesty, that open communication, and truth. And so, how are we actively and fumbling towards that and not being
That part.
afraid to be vulnerable with our communities when, we mess up and we make mistakes? But if we're not really putting our humanity on display, it's really hard for us to be on the front lines and really do the deep work that needs to be done to disrupt really some oppressive and racist practices that are really cemented in the project of schooling.
I want to just let that sit. This masterclass that you have taken us
Oh,
through.
thank you, brother. I appreciate you.
Um, and so while folks are I'm going to invite them to literally pause this podcast episode right here and go back and just sit with that. But when they press play again, how can they connect with you?
All right, y'all. Well, if y'all press play again, y'all can connect with me on Instagram at jotty.mercedes. I host also there. I'm moving towards making it more consistent now that I have defended my dissertation. I was in school for 6 years consecutively, and that was a lot. But I do host a show there, live run Sundays, where it's really centered around the works of Black folks, because oftentimes our work is invisibilized, particularly
Mm-hmm.
Black women,
Mm-hmm.
because Black women continue to be the black print of the work, continue to be the innovation. As you spoke about that first principle in New York City, I think about authors like Vanessa Siddle Walker, that really are historians of folks, Black leaders in education, that, this has always been at the forefront of the work. Education has always been important to us. Dr. Muhammad's work that really centers around Black literary societies, right? Black people have always been about this life, and Black women have always given us a model for this.
For sure.
And so I host a live there. Y'all can find me there. I'm also on Twitter at Yaribel, Yaribel Mercedes, where I'm also a contributor to Hip Hop Ed
Shout out to Hip Hop Ed,
Spaces.
fam.
Shout out to Hip Hop Ed. On Tuesdays, we usually have, conversations around questions that we're curious about and how we're thinking about, education and really thinking about hip hop practices when it comes to instruction and pedagogy. And so how we can leverage that. And so I'm a contributor there. I also, run my mouth on Twitter from time to time. But that's really how y'all can DM me, be in community with me, and also with my, all we need is one mic is one of my published pieces, but I also have other published pieces in Black Educology. Actually co-authored a piece with Dr. Bettina Love and Ashira Mothersill that really is centering the work of dream keepers and liberatory practices of Black educators in classrooms and what those practices have been. And it was such an honor to sit and be in community with those Black folks.
For sure.
And, other stuff that I have written, but y'all can do the Googles and stuff.
For sure.
But whenever y'all see me, I be in movement work. So y'all see me in conferences and, having a key in community with my people. So that's how y'all can find me.
Listen, do yourself a favor and make sure you follow my sister's work, follow the journey. She's inspiring. She's all things love and liberation, and we appreciate her. So shout out to you for spending this time, and thank you for just what you gave, even in this time.
Thank you, brother. Make sure that y'all are taking care of yourselves and your bodies. This work is hard work. This work is important work, but we are not able to do this work if we are not taking care of our bodies and of our nervous systems. And so, brother, as much as you are sending me love, I am sending you love. How are we taking care of ourselves? How are we cultivating spaces where our nervous systems are at ease and our community's nervous systems are at ease? And how are we cultivating spaces of joy where we are able to thrive, right? And community actualize in collective. And so, be curious about those things and take care of yourselves in the process.
For sure. For sure. Thank you again, sis.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate you.